She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frock, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For cock-a-crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cock-a-crow, dog-a-bark, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck-a-quack. Cock-a-crow, dog-a-bark, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck-a-quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back down, me now a come home. The naga jackass yard for fetchy load. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and Rover. From the farm, them a come. Sun a go down but up the river. Some washing clothes, some folks are bathing at the water. Fisherman, they catch them a bring. From a canoe boat, man, them start offloading. Aymara, Kwakwari, Hail Baka Kuma Kuma, even Lokonani. Aymara, Kwakwari, Hail Baka Kuma Kuma, even Bangameri. Listen to this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. Them children glad when the weekend come. Out in the yard, them all gather round. Some a play catcher, some making house from straw. Two who come later, a grandma or grandpa. All a sit down just a wait. Moonlight so bright, it's just the right time to listen story or to say a little nursery rhyme. Grandpa voice a echo in the night as he tell some picnic are there with fright. Oh Ligan, Mungeza, Massa Kurma Burra Nancy, even Watamuma. Oh Ligan, Mungeza, Massa Kurma Burra Nancy, even Watamuma. Yeah man, that's the true story that tell the people about life in the country, life in the country.
Hi, good evening. My name is Sharma Solomon. I'm your host this evening for Straight Up, sitting in for Mr. Mark Benchcop. And as usual, once Mark calls, it means he's with some professional duties, and he will continue to get congratulations from me on pursuing higher education, and also the commitment that we see Mark is with his family. But this evening, having the opportunity to sit in for Mark, I took the time to look at what was trending in the news. And very disturbing, a matter occurred this afternoon, or just before afternoon, in a statement issued by the Burnham Foundation with reference to the postponement, in fact, the cancellation of what was touted to be an independence photographic exercise, or in fact an exercise to be conducted by the Burnham Foundation at the Guyana National Library. This evening we have the head of the Burnham Foundation, Mr. Vincent Alexander, who also sits as the chair of, as one of the commissioner of GCOM, and also the representative of Epodigy chair. So I'll take this opportunity to, and with those introductions as portfolios, if we can get from Mr. Alexander, and let me express that I'm very grateful that I called Mr. Alexander this evening, and I said that as a member of the People's National Congress, as someone young to appreciate the values of Burnham in terms of what we as young people held on to on the party as an ideological position to shape our orientation as it relates to the Guyana that we want to see, and how that would have shaped for us our political path going forward as party members and as we pursue our political path. How do we see that being influenced by our founder leader, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham? So having this issue out this afternoon, I think it was most fitting. And let me again thank you, Mr. Alexander, for accepting this late notice to be on. But I'll get straight to the point on, I know there was a press statement issued this afternoon, but in your own words, can you say what at this moment is the position of the foundation as it relates to what occurred at the 11th hour before the exhibition this midday?
Well, first of all, the foundation approached the National Library on the 25th of April, seeking permission to mount an exhibition for independence. That permission was granted. As a consequence of the granting of that permission, we did a site visit last Wednesday, on which occasion the details were finalized. And so we went into full drive in preparation for that exhibition, which should have commenced today, with the setup this morning and the actual viewing starting from this afternoon. Minutes before I left the foundation's base for the library, I received a phone call from the chief librarian, in which phone call she intimated that we can no longer have the exhibition since they had something to be done in the said foyer. Well, that rang very, very strange to me because, as I said, we wrote in April, got commissioned then, visited last week on the 18th, finalized arrangements, went past Thursday, went past Friday, went past Saturday, and on the very day when this activity should be hosted, minutes before we should have been present to set up, we got that phone call. We could only come to one conclusion. Notwithstanding the fact that the librarian said that they had something to do, it is clear that up to the end of last week, they could not have had something to do, or else they would have communicated that to us. And that there must have been some intervention that caused them to communicate at the end moment that we could no longer proceed. That occurred became even more obvious when one of the media personnel seemed to have reported that some senior official, and I don't think this would have been the librarian herself, reported that some content check should have been done before permission was given. The fact of the matter is that we were never asked to present the content, never asked. And even if we were asked, we were prepared to do so. Because what we were about to engage on is an exhibition related to independence. Although we are the Burnham
But
Foundation.
before you get to that, and I'll come to that, the scope of the presentation and what that showcase represented. But when you did that walkthrough on the 18th, which in itself was an exercise to rehearse what goes where and when, in itself would demonstrate what sort of content and what scope this exercise is with. Who or those persons that were there, what are their authorities in terms of the position held at the national level. That they
Well,
were unaware that an event at that point of having such an exercise, you're physically there going through the different areas and measurement and identifying in a rehearsal way how this exhibition is going to be done. Those who were there with you, what authority that then said that they weren't aware something would be
on
on.
Wednesday, when we got to the library, we reported to the office of the chief librarian. That's the office to which we had been communicating and the office to which we. The young lady, whom I presume is her personal assistant, accompanied us downstairs, showed us the area in which the exhibition could be mounted, showed us the facilities that would be available. In fact, she specified that 2 screens would be available, one on the northern side of the staircase, one on the southern side of the staircase, and that 3 uh, bookcases would be available for the exhibition of books as well. So it was someone in authority out of the office of the chief librarian to whom we reported and who accompanied us to the area and specified what facilities would be available for the purpose of our exhibition. We had been communicating through that person all along. Suffice to say that when we sent the letter, we got a response to our letter directly from the librarian herself.
Now, with your understanding that there was some desire to have a view beforehand of content, and you've expressed that you weren't unwilling to show that content for the public. What was that content? Because I think I am certain for those who are fearful of what that content is, maybe you can ease some of that fear and educate some of those of us who would like to.
I don't think that anybody had any fear of the content. I just think that there is a disposition of the present regime to suppress the truth, to rewrite our history, and to occupy all of the political, social, economic space in this country. The content of our exhibition was focused and is focused on the events of 1966. The whole question of Guyana attaining independence, events depicting the hoisting of the flag at midnight of May 25th into the 26th, the parliamentary sitting where the instruments of independence were handed over, the various activities, cultural activities, and other activities surrounding independence, the presence of visitors, representative of the Queen, uh, the visit to the town hall, they were all national activities associated with independence. But we intended to show at the very first pictorial exhibit was a pictorial exhibit of Thomas Burnham and Chetty Jagan leaving Guyana, uh, going overseas at the time when our constitution had been suspended. In their campaign collectively for Guyana, and to show that that was a moment, an important moment in the struggle for independence. So that was the very first exhibit that we were intended and are going to fact mount, showing Chetty and Forbes leaving Guyana, the time when we needed to go overseas to visit England, to visit India, to visit Ghana, other countries in protestation over the suspension of the constitution and the imposition of our interim parliament, so National Assembly, so to speak. But all of the photographs were related to the events surrounding independence. There were a few photographs related to CARICOM as well coming into existence, because we see that also as a continuation of the process of strengthening our independence. So we had some photographs depicting that as well. But they were all apolitical photographs depicting the whole question of what occurred. The military parade, the inspection of the parade, the parade of the volunteer force as they were going out, the parade of the Guyana Defense Force as they came in, all things depicting the movement towards and the actual moment of the independence of Guyana.
What say Vincent Alexander, head of the Burnham Foundation, on the argument that the father of independence is a question between those who supported the PPP as it relates to independence being robbed of from the PPP for geopolitical reasons, and also those who say that the modern father of independence are the working man and woman of Guyana. What do say Vincent Alexander of the Burnham Foundation?
First of all, one has to take a factual position on this question. The fact of the matter is that
and the reason I ask the question, so sorry to interrupt you, is because it comes back to, if you don't believe the depiction of the representation of what you were going to put at the National Library carries that biased narrative.
What we were going to put in the library was a factual depiction of what occurred. A factual depiction of what occurred. It's the real history of our country. Suffice to say that one should note that for political reasons, the last conference leading up to independence was not attended by Dr. Chedi Jagan. He boycotted that conference. And therefore, the final negotiation for independence was conducted by a team led by Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham, a team that would have included Petit Degar, and the team would have included others, including the late Assemblyman, Mr. Bisemba. So that ushering in independence was the involvement of Burnham negotiating and finalizing that ushering in. And at the time of the granting of independence, we saw Burnham occupying the seat as the premier, moving into that position of Prime Minister of Guyana. So that Burnham was at the center of the movement of Guyana from being a colony to being an independent nation.
So that notwithstanding, no question,
our first photograph depicted Burnham and Jagan because we accept that Jagan was involved in the movement for independence. But the fact of the matter is that he was not the one who finalized the arrangements, was not the one in the seat at the time, and therefore could not be considered to be the father of something which he did not usher in.
And to those who say that it is the working man and woman of the nation?
I didn't get that.
And to those who say that it's the working man and woman of the nation that is the father of independence, father and mother of independence?
I don't know how people who did not negotiate and finalize independence, people who were not the ones to receive the instruments, could be considered as the father and the mother of Guyana and as those who would have ushered in independence. That's a part of the revisionism which we are subjected to, a revisionism which is reflected in the denial of the exhibition, because the exhibition will depict the truth without us having to tell a tale or tell a story. The exhibition speaks for itself, and therefore one can understand why such an exhibition has been repressed, because it will simply tell the truth in the face of the blatant revisionism which we are subjected to. We had no intention of entering into an encounter or an engagement with anyone. We simply wanted to depict the truth of what represents the moments of the ushering of the independence of Guyana.
Okay, so I like that, Vincent. I see that where you're expressing the actual intent of the depictions that were going to be on display. What now becomes of that, Vincent?
Let me say, first of all,
with such a powerful representation that not only sets a narrative, but corrects on many narratives. What becomes of this exposition that
let me first of all say that we are celebrating the 56th anniversary of Guyana's independence. And it behoves the educators, it behoves the elders, it behoves the knowledgeable to pass on information and knowledge to the nation, and more particularly to the children, so they can know the history. It behoves us. And so, as the Burnham Foundation, we found it obligatory to be a part of that process of passing on that knowledge and that information. We will not be deterred by anyone who seeks to interfere with that process. And therefore, we are working assiduously to ensure that in the new day, that exhibition will be available to the people of Guyana. In the new day, we will make that announcement as to where and when the exhibition can be viewed by the people of Guyana.
Thank you for that, Vincent. And as we approach our 56th independence anniversary, what coming from the Burnham Foundation and having accepted as you just did, not only his vital role, but where he played his critical part in shaping what we inherit today as the Independence Project. What are your views on where this project is? Coming from that perspective.
One needs to understand what independence means. The word independence sometimes is used coterminous with the word liberation. Independence meant and means two things. In the first instance, that we were put in a position where we can exercise sovereignty as a people, rather than have a foreign power exercise sovereignty. In other words, be in a position where we can make our own decisions about the conduct of public affairs and the destiny of our country. That is not possible simply by decision making, because decision making in the face of economic external pressures and forces can impose upon us that we're still not a liberated people. And so independence also means, to a very large extent, being able to take control of our economic and social destiny. In that regards, one cannot divorce independence from the vision of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, because what he envisaged was not only political independence, where we would have this ceremonial handing over of power to a national body, but he envisaged independence at large, where our economy would permit us to be masters of our own destiny. And what is interesting to note is that that vision of Burnham has not died. It has lived on to today. You know, it's interesting, rather interesting, that on the eve of independence, we have had an agricultural
I wanted to ask you about that.
investment expo. And when one looks at that, one could see the blueprint of Lyndon Forbes and Sampson Burnham in all that is being done and in all that is being said. And therefore, one can come to recognize that what Burnham sought to do is what was necessary and what is necessary if we are indeed to achieve independence. Suffice to say that the essence of what Burnham sought to do is not necessarily manifest in the form of what is being done now, though the form is a reflection of what Burnham sought to do. What do I mean by that? Burnham sought to bring about economic independence to the nation at large, which meant that everyone was going to be touched by our economic growth and development. We see today that the whole question of food security is still very much on the agenda. But we, at the same time, we see that that food security is focused on a class and a sector rather than on the people. So whilst we might have a situation where we produce as much as the nation needs and we embrace CARICOM in that regard, that process seems not intended to lend to the ordinary Guyanese involvement in that process in a manner that would allow what Burnham talked about, the small man being a real man.
But
So
do you
on one hand, we can see the image of what Burnham intended. On the other hand, there's the absence of the essence of what he intended. And so we find it very necessary, not only to demonstrate that image, but to articulate that essence for the nation at large to know.
But how do you see that as a challenge? Burnham taking on that which promotes the bottom-up sort of development, small man, the real man, the sort of agriculture, house, clothes, feed yourself type of initiatives, as labeled as very socialist in its orientation, in this liberal democratic situation that we find ourselves in. How applicable do you see that then as it relates to the sort of resources we have now and what is available?
Well, certainly the resources now are likely would have made it far more feasible and possible. Suffice to say that initially, what happened to Burnham was not merely a question of the availability of resources. It was a question of all sorts of pressures that we suffered from forces internally and from forces externally. Much of our income was affected by the continuous burning of sugar canes that did not allow for the realization of the financial resources for the pursuit of the um, objective that Burnham had. We became victims of the oil crisis that saw an escalation of oil prices and therefore eating into our foreign currency that we wanted to use for the purpose of national development. We saw that foreign forces virtually impose all sorts of restrictions on Guyana because of its socialist intent and socialist rhetoric. Suffice to say that the question of development is not restricted to what may be considered the socialist approach. It is a question of institutional development, a question of equity, a question of, in some regards, a social democratic and a welfare approach to development rather than a pure free market approach. And so we saw that Burnham talked about the trisectoral economy, notwithstanding what people say, a trisectoral economy that sought to involve the private sector. And there are those of the private sector from that area who have survived up to today. We can point at them, count them. We talked about the public sector, and we still see a role for the public sector even today, probably a diminished role in the context of globalization. But he also talked about the cooperative sector, an important sector that would have allowed for the small man, through his form of private enterprise, so to speak, to be involved in economic activities and therefore to get a fair share of the cake. And that's where things are different today.
And that is why I want to ask you then, Vincent, its application today. where we see a private sector is enticed heavily by a government, by the state, where we see the cooperative sector on the back foot through the credit unions and even the trade unions. And for those small enterprise, where we see the public sector is taking a beating with increase in salaries and treatment with regards to cost of living. There is no plan in place to ensure that the people who are paying more for chicken and bread understand how they fit into any sector. How do you see the application, the difficulty of getting people to convert to this idea of a socialist intervention as opposed to the way the PPP is managing the state, and people seem to be okay with that?
I don't want to make a reference to it as a socialist intervention. I want to make a reference to it as an intervention that gives an opportunity to the ordinary people to be involved in economic activities, social and other activities of the country. And not necessarily and specifically socialists, because socialists to a large extent
Carries a
speaks to
bad
the
word. In
issue.
America, we see people took Obama apart for socialists. We see people taking
But
Venezuela
that was
apart.
a misrepresentation of what socialism
And this is
is
why
all
I asked.
about.
This is where I asked the clarification from
It's a
your side of the
misrepresentation.
application in today's.
Socialism at large spoke to ownership of the economy via the public sector. We are not talking about ownership of the economy via the public sector. We are talking about a trisectoral arrangement with a public sector indeed that would, Burnham said at that time, would have control over the commanding heights of the economy, but not the control over the economy at large, with a cooperative sector that would give the ordinary man access to resources and economic activities. And what was essential then was really the institutional framework that was being created. Institutional framework that allowed for the ordinary man to have equitable access to resources through cooperatives that would allow him to be engaged in economic activities and economic development. And that is where we have a difference now. We don't have that equitable access of the small man. Equitable access would have come through institutions like the cooperative bank, like the mortgage and finance bank, like the agricultural bank. Those were the institutions intended to give that equitable access. We see today that even the state, in its outreach to international funding agencies, talks about funding for the private sector. There's no talk about funding for the endeavors of the ordinary man. And what the ordinary man has to be subjected to is some kind of trickle-down economics, where the private sector expands and the ordinary man benefits if jobs are available. That's what we see, and benefits through these occasional handouts from the state. That is quite different to what was intended. And I want to make the point that though we talk about socialism, that what was intended is not married to the state controlling everything as is envisaged in a socialist environment. Indeed, the bias was towards socialism, but it was married to the cooperatives. We were closer to the model that one found in a place like Yugoslavia, rather than to the model that one found in the Soviet Union or the model that one found in the other Cuba. We were closer to the model that one found in Tanzania with the Ujamaa, where there was an attempt to do it bottom up, with the state not necessarily controlling economic activities or being directly involved in economic activities, but the state creating an environment in which the ordinary man could be equally involved in economic activities. And there is this mantra that I have found to be an expression of what we wanted. Indeed, one could see the private sector as the engine of growth. And in that regard, I include in the private sector the cooperatives, because for all intents and purposes, that was private ownership, albeit at the cooperative and collective level. So the private sector being the engine of growth. But counterbalancing that growth would be the public sector, the government being the facilitator of development, because development is not equivalent to mere economic growth. Development is equivalent to the way in which the people at large are able to benefit from economic growth in terms of the access to health services, the access to education, the access to culture and leisure, the access to employment, a reduction in the mortality rate in the society, a reduction in the level of poverty in the society. Those are the measures and indicators of development, not mere economic
Well,
expansion.
well, you know, they say growth. They say growth based on which one of the economists you're speaking to. They say growth equals development, and some say growth
Growth is not equal development,
don't necessarily
and the
equal
United
development.
Nations,
Well,
which is
well, it
not
depends on who you're speaking to, Vincent, because
not only a matter of whom I'm speaking to, it's a matter of whom I'm speaking about. The
okay,
United Nations, a place that seeks to bring about global consensus, has itself agreed that economic growth is not equivalent to development. And they have come up with indicators which I was referring to, indicating if one wants to measure development, one has to look at the state of the health of the nation, the state of the education of the nation, the state of the literacy of the nation, the state of the poverty alleviation in the nation, the state of leisure and cultural activities in the nation, the enhancement of the quality of life rather than the mere enhancement of the material production in the society. Of course, the material production is important because that material production can lend to those things. But it can only lend to those things if there is the correct distribution of the wealth being produced. And in that regard, the state has to play a role as the facilitator of that distribution to the benefit of the people at large.
as we approach Thursday, 56 years, Thursday, we spoke on the quest for independence. We showed where those critical roles were played by the individuals that played them. We established exactly what that sort of thinking in terms of a heavy embrace of social application in getting not only the private, public, but getting the cooperative sector involved in a tri-sector approach. 56 years Thursday, as Guyana and Guyanese embrace new wealth in island gas, do you see our project of independence as a failure or a success?
At this point, we see two things. On one hand, we still have retained political sovereignty, so to speak. And so one of the
Even in the face of
platforms,
multilateralism.
in the face of multilateralism, but one of the platforms for development and independence and liberation is in place. The problem we may have is how that platform is populated and how that platform is utilized. That platform is in place, and therefore we can point to a movement away from the colonial state to a post-colonial state with a greater opportunity of the people exercising sovereignty. We have seen and we are seeing economic growth. What we are not seeing is the kind of distribution of the wealth being produced to foster development. We have seen a tremendous potential in terms of economic growth, but we're not seeing policies and programs that are intended to ensure that economic growth redounds to the benefit of the people. Of
So this,
course, in absolute terms, we will see that people will not necessarily be where they were 56 years ago. But in terms of the wealth that's available, the disparity and the gap between those who have and those who don't have, notwithstanding that the haves may be in absolute terms, in numerical terms, in arithmetic terms, better off, so to speak. The gap between them and those who are at the top of the ladder increases, and so in relative terms, those at the bottom have in fact retrogressed given the economic growth that has occurred. People live by expectations. And in terms of the expectations of the people, today we have a greater gap between the expectations and what's available to them. And that in itself represents a retrogression.
so you're saying, Lincoln,
Retrogression.
you're saying, Vincent, our argument, though we should have an argument, should not be too focused on our multinationals and any neocolonialistic approach that we may have in terms of not having a fair share and Guyana not being treated right, but more internal to our own mechanisms of management based on now having even more resources, our inability to have that resources distributed in an equitable and equal manner so that people can benefit from what is also added to the pot, so to speak. That is your position.
I'll say two things about that. We cannot take the position that we're unaffected by the multilateralism which you spoke about. We still live in a world that's interconnected. We still live in a world where some countries are at the center and others at the periphery. And to that extent, that relationship retards our growth and our development. But even if that relationship persists, we have mirrored that peripheral and center paradigm internally as well, so that in relative terms, even as we get more to be shared internally, the manner in which it's being shared has not represented an opportunity for the ordinary man to get a greater part of the pie. So it's kind of dichotomous. Yes, we are in a situation where as a quote unquote developing third world country, we're still suffering from the multilateral situation that sees the peripheral countries being exploited by those in the metropole. But we have seen at the same time absolute expansion of the wealth internally. But in the absolute expansion of the wealth internally, we've seen a mirroring of the relationship that is the multilateral relationship mirrored internally with a certain class and a certain set of people being able to benefit to a greater extent than the ordinary people. And in relative terms, ordinary people slip into a position of poverty as the wealthy people become even more wealthy.
Well, Vincent, let me say, I look forward to seeing the exhibition. I know that notwithstanding the challenges that you guys encountered today, the Burnham Foundation, that there is high expectation in seeing the outline of the factual representation through pictures and storylines of how we got to our state of independence. I also see where you were explaining the application of the Burnham ideology and it's relevant in today's context, whether people see socialism as a bad thing, where it's still applicable, of ensuring we have a bottom-up approach and an ownership of wealth that belongs to a collective and even the public. So I see that on Thursday, 56 years, as we go towards our independence, that we have much more work to be done. And with that amount of work to be done, I would hope that, and in fact, look forward to seeing the Burnham Foundation playing its significant part in ensuring that not only work is done, but work is done in the right way, with the right education and the correct information. But we touched on something that came out of the independence struggle that really set for Guyana what continues to be something that poses like a perpetual battle and struggles between the political and even at some time and in more than others, the racial context. And this is our electoral system. You sit as one of the commissioner of the Guyana Elections Commission. And we know coming out of whether it's proportional representation or first past the post, and even as we move to have the adjustments within the 60s of our electoral system, coming out of our colonial struggles, and then we had those reforms in the 90s, when all those voices came together to say they needed to have a change in our electoral system, moved 2 years from 90 to 92, even to accommodate those changes such as counting at the place of polls, and to also ensure that we have the issue within the commission, and also to have reforms deeper within the commission. What do you see now as a commissioner? First, on the question of the government, and I use those 2 points of a collective approach to move to reforms. What we see is an exclusive approach by the government of Guyana. How much legitimacy is being given to this process? And I know up to last Friday, you made the pronouncement that it was ludicrous of the engagements that were being held between the government of Guyana and GCOM in particular.
Let me say, first of all, that what occurred in terms of 1992 was mechanisms for elections rather than any meaningful reform of our electoral system to reflect the national reality. Those were mechanisms, mechanics. An attempt was made in the 1997-2001 reforms to move to a reform of the electoral system to be reflective of our reality, as opposed to what happened in the earlier period. The fact of the matter is that in the 1997-2001 process, it was an incomplete process that we agreed to return to after the elections of 2001. And there's been no demonstrated commitment to return to that. So in fact, we as a people have not committed ourselves to the actual reform that was articulated leading up to the 1997-2001 reform process. So those reforms remain incomplete. The fact of the matter is that we live in a plural society, a society which for historical reasons has seen our politics being dominated by ethnicity, and our politics which has led to the possibility of ethnic majority rule. A rule which cannot be beneficial to Guyana at large. We have seen the resistance to that process. And in 2022, we have seen a continuation of that resistance. But what have we seen? We've seen in the elections of 2022 about which there are endless question marks in terms of the voters list, in terms of the inability to account for over 14,000 votes on these course, in terms of accusations against Mingo. We see all sorts of things, but we do not see those things being addressed. We see the skewed approach to addressing the concerns of one set of people in the way in which they have dealt with the Mingos and others whom they have deemed to be guilty, even if the courts are still to pronounce, and have not at all addressed the question of the bloated voters lists, of the evidence, I repeat, that persons who were dead were voted for, of the evidence that persons who were overseas were voted for, and have used that environment to continue to perpetuate ethnic majority rule, rather than, on one hand, ensure that we have machinery that provides for one person, one vote, but more than that, to move to a machinery that allows for a government that's inclusive. We do not have inclusive government, even though the reforms of 1997 and 2001 sought to move us in that direction. We see that lots of the mechanisms established under the Constitution have not been implemented. We've never had the Human Rights Commission in place. For extended periods, we don't have the Ethnic Relations Commission in place. We don't have the Integrity Commission in place. We don't have the Public Service Commission in place. And when they are in place, unfortunately, the manner in which they've been constituted is not reflective of the intent of inclusion and allows for dominance and domination. A dominance and domination which is being perpetuated by the dominators, even in the recent amendments to the provisions for the Public Accounts Committee. So the ruling party now can determine whether the committee meets.
As in the case of today.
You've seen recently, only a few days, 2 days ago, that it did not meet, simply because they did not turn up under some excuse of paying attention to the floods. So we see that there has not been a commitment to good governance which talks about inclusion. We've seen the perpetuation of exclusion by virtue of how our various boards are constituted, how our various commissions are constituted, how our various boards and commissions are not constituted at all. And the state finds itself under the reins of a government that contends that it won an election and therefore has a right, and does not recognize the role of civil society, does not recognize that governance means not only winning elections, governance means being responsive to the people, and that responsiveness is very often exercised through the press and through civil society as interest groups. That's how that responsiveness is exercised. Governance means not only winning an election, but having a representative arrangement that seeks to allow the people to be able to express their views in between elections and not have us told that they won, and if you have a problem, wait until the next elections. That was never intended to be the system of democracy or the system of governance. So even in the present construct, without addressing the ethnic problem, we have a construct that, if implemented, could make a difference. But it's not been implemented, it's been bypassed, and it's imposing a relative minority on the will of the majority.
So two parts, and I want to ask I really want you to answer the last one, but I want to still bring this point of in the 90s, we may not have had from the 92 to 90 very deep in terms of constitutional, but very mechanical and very institutional in the sort of changes made. But the attempts were made in the later 90s, 97 to, 90, to 2000, 2001, where we saw constitutional reforms being attempted but incompleted. At this moment, with the government saying through the Attorney General that they are not looking to go deep in reforms in constitutional, they have cherry picked a few areas that they want to look at, including the division of Region 4 and other matters that even the Electoral Reform Committee criticized them. Even GCOM in its meeting on Friday was critical about the scope and what was on the agenda to be discussed. What do you see as the role of the chairman at this moment? Do you see her as an obstructionist, or you see her helpful to GCOM's cause at the moment?
I see her as a facilitator of what the government is seeking to do. The chairman, for whatever reason, facilitates what the government commissioners seek to do and what the government seeks to do. We do not have the facilitation of reasoned discussion and engagement. What we have, and sometimes, is no discussion and no engagement, and at other times, a deaf ear to reasoned discussion and engagement.
Is there
And
common?
this is exemplified by a situation which I have spoken to public already, where we are engaged in a discussion on a matter. And lo and behold, at the end of the engagement, the chairman goes into her lap and brings out what she calls a ruling, which suggests that she was not listening and not engaged in the discussion, but had a prior disposition and ruled. So it became a farce. The activity of GCOM became farcical because she who should have been involved in moderating, in struggling to bring about consensus, didn't even listen to what was being said. In fact, because a prior determination was foisted upon the commission. We are in a bad place at this point in time. We do not have a GCOM.
So then do you agree? So then do you agree with both the president, in fact, the vice president and the leader of the opposition, that the current construct of 331 should be left alone?
I agree that there's need for a review of the situation at GCOM. Suffice to say that for me, the bigger problem is our political culture. And one has no guarantee that a change of personnel, a reconfiguration, will necessarily result in something different, given the political culture the country has embraced. And so for me, more fundamental is the question of our political culture. But indeed, you may find mechanisms of changes that may facilitate an emergence of a different culture. But a mere change of the reconfiguration is not a guarantee. Guyana needs a commitment to an understanding of inclusion, a commitment and understanding that everybody should be involved, because very often so-called civil society reflects. Let me go back. When we had the constitutional reform process, you know what happened? The various parties were asked to come up with the organizations that would represent civil society. We had, for example, on that commission, an organization representing the Muslim youth. That person came from the belly of the PPP. We had an organization representing the farmers. That person came from the belly of the PPP. So in fact, civil society in the classical sense was not represented. The politics of the PPP has always been to find a way to dominate so-called civil society, to establish front organizations in the name of civil society.
As we see the
And so
president is
really,
doing.
deeply, we have to look at our political culture, that culture of domination, that culture of manipulation, that culture of control, that culture of non-inclusion as the basis for moving this country forward, rather than simply replacing one set of people or one institution with another. But because we saw what happened in the 1997-2000 reform, we have new institutions, but they don't represent the real change insofar as they're dominated and not necessarily institutions of inclusion and institutions of consensus.
So we're stuck in a dilemma of even if we consider civil society. A few weeks ago, the president was very critical of the civil society forum. To even
He's
ask,
critical of any civil society which they do not control and which do not reflect their views. And in fact, symbolically embraces civil society if by a chance they make the correct, what they consider to be pronouncements that are beneficial. So the Electoral Reform Group has been, after being condemned as not representing anybody, has been partially embraced because they sought to come forward and engage in those consultations, so-called consultations.
which I must say they were very critical, nevertheless.
They were critical, but it is beneficial to the PPP to say, we engage these people. Because the engagement itself will not necessarily result in a real consultation where what they say
As
is
was
the
said,
Constitution.
as was said, it's not to go deep. And I'm coming now to this, that the Attorney General is saying, as the PPP is saying, and they said to the Electoral Reform Committee, that they're not going to go to constitutional. I know the leader of the opposition is saying that shortly will be writing to the Attorney General asking for some amount of depth in terms of electoral reforms and these constitutional reforms in general. Now, what worked in 1990, you said, were more mechanical and institutional. I know on the table, and I want to be, I'm taking this as a consensus. I know on the table there is consensus by GCOM for the biometrics. This doesn't seem as deep as constitutional and the need for, this seems more mechanical. Can something like this then, with consensus already, have the sort of go ahead? And I know it's something that you've been pushing.
Let me say two things. I do not know that there's a consensus on biometrics.
It was reported in Kaituro News by.
I know if one reads carefully what Kaituro News said, it would suggest that myself and my colleagues would have embraced this question of biometrics. It also suggests that one PPP commissioner said that she has no problem with it, but it does not speak to an internal consensus in GCOM about biometrics. So we need to get that clear. The second point I want to make is that biometrics addresses the mechanics of voting and can provide for a transient interim arrangement in relation to ensuring that you don't have multiple voting, duplicate voting. But it does not address the essence of our electoral system, which does not provide a government that is representative of the people's interests and a government that is based on consensus building. So yes, biometrics is useful because it can take us closer to a free and fair election. But a free and fair election is not the only problem we are faced with. We are faced with the need for an electoral system that is proper government that embraces and reflects true governance. We have a situation where a government is thrown up that does not reflect all of the elements of democracy. It only reflects, and flawedly so, reflects elections. But in
Well,
terms of representativeness, in terms of responsiveness, in terms of responsible behavior, transparency, it is not reflective of those things.
now,
And so we have to go beyond
now that
getting
we
a
know that,
government that's elected to getting a government that's responsible and a government that's responsive, and then we can talk democracy.
now that we know that, we have an idea as to what the People's Progressive Party is prepared to see as not only responsiveness, but even as they approach the issue of electoral reforms. We see the depth, and even by the Attorney General's own admission, that that will require the opposition. We hear the opposition leader saying that he is prepared to engage on this matter. How deep do you see reforms taking place at the level of ROPA?
But at this time, I have tremendous reservations. I have seen that PEP frequency speaks about 2025. And the pace at which the reforms are being unfolded, with them saying they are starting with reform of RUPA. I wouldn't call it electoral reform. I will call it some adjustments to RUPA, much of which is superficial, much of which represents no real change. Well, that's where they're starting. Then they said then they will go to the National Registration Act as the next, and then to the Constitution. When we know that at the center of what's required is the Constitution. So I can see them dragging this out to 2025 without getting to constitutional reform.
What about all those recommendations that were made by the observers that came, and some of them are common? Are they not common that we can have a starting position in terms
They're
of...
common but ignored. The major recommendation made by the observers, two major recommendations. One is the need for a new voters list, being ignored. We have Jagdeo getting out there and saying that there are things in place to provide for that. And what he has suggested is absolutely nothing new. In fact, it's worse than what we have. So that recommendation is not being embraced. The recommendation to have a new voters list, not being embraced. The recommendation about an electoral system that's reflective of the plurality of our society, not being embraced. The recommendation, as I said, to have a new voters list, to have real electoral reform, not at all being embraced, and we're being sucked into superficial reform at the RUPA level as the other levels and the most critical level, the foundational level. The Constitution is the foundation of our legal system. It's the foundation of our electoral system. And therefore, no real reform can occur if we start with the enabling legislation, which cannot take us to the crux of the matter, as where the reform occurs. We're dealing again with mechanics. We're not dealing with assets.
So I take this as the stalemate situation at GCOM.
At this point, it should be considered that way.
And the movement, or any tangible movement, starts back with the engagement by the leader of the opposition and the sort of request that he is going to make with regards to the scope. He is hoping to have the discussion on reforms at the level of GCOM and even constitutional reforms in general, as you're suggesting, because any GCOM reforms, as the AG is suggesting, only looks at ROPA. But I ask you this, in the essence of ensuring that the commission continues to function, and we're talking the functionality of the commission and some of what it needs to, for example, prepare for local government elections. Do you see these sort of things acting as impediments towards elections such as local government elections and
I
GCOMs?
see something like the biometric proposal being a minimum proposal that we should seek to have before local government elections. Even as we seek to have real reform of our electoral system for the purpose of throwing up a government that's representative, I see the need, I repeat, for at minimum that biometric proposal being embraced. And therefore, the need for us to take Commissioner Shadiq at her word and to have her work with us and to have the chairperson understand that there's a relative majority in this regard and that that majority should be embraced. And we should not have judge-like rulings which are not reflective of reasoned positions that may be articulated in the commission.
I hear that. And I like that. I like that position because it demonstrates that even though it may only be one, it is still a position that carries some level of consensus understanding of the importance of at least fixing some mechanism so that we can have an accountable election, and as soon as, in fact, local government elections. I like that. As we wind down, I want to ask some matters on epodology, just quickly. And before we get to epodology, is there anything on GCOM that you would like to close on before we get into a conversation on epodology?
Well, I think I've said it, what I want to say in GCOM. We are not as yet a body that seeks to operate based on reason and consensus. To a large extent, the relationship at the level of the political parties is reflected in what occurs at GCOM. And so there is need. My own view is that to a large extent, the way in which the population responds will have a lot to do with the way in which both GCOM and the political forces are responding. The political forces feel they can run roughshod over us. That's what's going to happen. So that it requires the voice of the population to push the political directorate in the right direction. And in fact, push GCOM in the right direction.
Understood. 2.5 years almost before we complete this decade of people of African descent. Are you satisfied? Satisfied with the amount of work that were done so far by epodology?
No, I'm not satisfied. I think there is much more that could have and should have been done. We have suffered from a number of things. On one hand, we have suffered from insufficiency of resources.
But one would say that the state a few years ago should have or could have been a little more sympathetic in understanding that an entire race of people coming out of emancipation was deliberately left behind. And the United Nations, in recognizing that, not only give a year, but subsequent give a decade. Do you not think that resources could have or should have been made available?
Indeed, resources should have been made available. We have, in fact, been stuck with the subvention originally given to us, and notwithstanding our proposals for an increase, nothing has been forthcoming. So there's been inflation, there's been increase in salaries and all of that. And we've been stuck with the same subvention. So that's one of the problems of resources. The other problem has been, in some regards, unresponsiveness to calls which have been made. We have made calls in relation to how we think villages should be treated in terms of the establishment of village councils. There's been unresponsiveness to that. We have made calls in relation, for example, to how the Rastafarian sect should be treated. We have heard rhetoric about responses, but there's been no real response in that regard. So that we have not seen the kind of responsiveness. There's nothing in what we have heard from the state that says we recognize that there's need for recognition, justice, and development, and therefore equitable treatment. We have heard some talk about reparations, and that seems to be focused more on external reparations. We've not seen anything internal. We've not seen the kind of recognition that says, indeed, coming out of the slavery, coming out of the colonial state, our institutions have not always been friendly to the people of African descent and their need for changes. Rather, what we've seen recently with the youths, adolescents, being chargeable for indictable offenses. When one looks at who are those youths, we can see that the institutions are being skewed against the people of African descent in some regards, rather than addressing the problems that we have in terms of issues of poverty and issues of jobs and so forth. We've taken the old approach of using the police force and the justice system, incarceration, rather than taking a social welfare and sociological approach, trying to address the questions of poverty that are at the very margin of our social problems.
Now, why do you think these social justice issues that are affecting the communities, especially Afro-Guyanese communities, we are not having people who, for example, the state through enforcement and welfare support, we are not able to first convince the state, as you said, they're not listening, and we ourselves, what is so challenging that the state or even ourselves have up as obstacles that makes it difficult for us to deal with some of these challenges?
I think we're affected in Ghana by classism, which is built onto the ethnic problem. In command of this country at this point in time is a class of people who, in the main, happen to be people of certain ethnicity. And what they do, they drag along with them their kith and kin to the detriment of that kith and kin. And that classism does not reflect an interest in the people at large, it reflects an interest in that class. And that's a major element of our problem. And built under that is many instances, the approach of individuals who have now seen individualism as a mechanism for survival rather than collectivism. So what we have are individuals who are cowering to that class, trying to join that class, trying to benefit from that class, rather than challenging that class, which is the source of their problem.
I mean, you're representing, your organization is an empowerment organization to Afro-Guyanese. And what you just identify is a serious level of weakness in many Afro-Guyanese to want to cow and to stoop to a certain class. Why do you believe there is, if not intimidation, or a willingness for persons to want to indulge with that class?
They have been battered into that position. There are two issues here: individualism as opposed to individuality. So the people start off by wanting to benefit, to grow and develop. So that's inherent in the human being. And what some people are doing is taking the shortcut that they will do it as an individual by cowering and not recognizing, at the end of the day, what we need is a transformation that allows for the movement of all rather than for the movement of one or two to the detriment of the majority.
Mm, mm. All right, because I know that Epodigy is, in fact, let me congratulate. I know you had the economic forum a few weeks ago, where young people presented some pitch on initiatives that they establish as business ventures. What is the next activity that we can see from Epodigy as part of its empowerment?
So we have ongoing activities, but the major thing that we are now looking at is a major conversation with the state on the question of the state of people of African descent and the kind of policies that ought to be implemented to address that. That's the major thing we look into to undertake during this year.
Okay, okay. But how are your thoughts on the last exercise with regards to young Afro-Guyanese in terms of business innovation and business
That's an
ideas?
ongoing exercise, and we are trying as far as possible through various activities to deal at the psychological level with people of African descent in terms of the disposition to business. But that alone will not work. It will require an environment that is more conducive, an institutional framework that's more conducive. So on one hand, as we work with them, we also have to work to get the state to assist in creating the right environment.
So as we wind this down, Vincent, let me just say this in relation to the Epodigy and what Epodigy represents. In the next 2.5 years, first, do you believe that many of the agendas and the targets that were set, are you going to have that? And if not, what sort of aggressive actions are you prepared to take to get to that?
As I said, our main approach, you have to have two approaches. One is to work among our people and to make our own organizations far more effective into the future. And two is to deal with the government in the question of the environment in which we're existing.
I did say aggressive, yeah?
Huh?
I did
Well,
say,
I think we have to take on this position of strong negotiations with the government, strong advocacy, and to take the people along with us in that process.
hmm, hmm. And I want to thank you, Vincent, for having this opportunity to share so many things with us this evening. In fact, so much knowledge on first the issue of the Burnham Foundation. I look forward dearly to seeing that exhibition. I'm certain quite a few people are looking forward to seeing that exhibition. A very factual exhibition, as you explained it to be. It gives a good understanding of the struggles of our independence. And I think, as you were saying, it really puts to rest the father of the nation argument with regards to independence. I know, covering from the issues of GCOM and all its complexities, we hope that at least for local government, we can see Ms. Shadiq lending support with the other commissioners to have the biometrics introduced so that we can have this sort of accountability at the elections. And with the Epodigy in programs, I want to congratulate not only yourself, but the entire Epology committee. I know I've seen many of the young people. They're doing quite well in terms of promoting and pushing some of the agenda. I know it's going to be a challenge, but I wish you all well, and I know that that internal and external, you'll have the difficulties, but I see that a lot that you guys have gotten done, and I know you'll continue to get much more done. So thanks for all of that, Vincent.
Thanks for having me. We're prepared for the long haul.
Yeah, no problem. And let me thank you publicly on, I know we spoke on the elections issue. There was a particular aspect on the election. Just quickly, I want to ask, what are your thoughts in terms of the involvement of bilateral partners in our elections as we signed the 2020 situation? We signed in the 90s with the Carter Center. We signed the 2000s, 97 with the Ordmanston Accord. We've always seen a very involved role of foreign partners in our elections. Do you see this interference in itself as one that allows for different outcomes? Or do you see this interference as one designed sincerely to ensure that we have the best outcomes?
Let me put it this way: the world we live in, there are going to be observers in our elections, but I think we have, as a nation, to draw the line in terms of what observers are allowed to do and what they're not allowed. I think in the last elections, the observers went beyond the pale in what they were allowed to do.
Hmm. All right. So then the question still remains unanswered. Because I know, and persons who may not know you, you helped in my final year research yourself, Aubrey Norton, Ronald Austin, Dr. Henry Jeffrey. I did call, but he did said he was going to help. So let me give him credit for that. And I know it focused heavily on regime change. And if this is where some of that involvement, as you side, do you believe last election 2020 there was such, if not an effort, an outcome?
Go that again.
Do you believe in the 2020 elections, if not an effort, there was such an outcome for regime change?
I think there was regime change in 2022. There was regime change because what occurred in 2022, in my honest opinion, should not have been accepted as an election that produced a result. My own disposition was that all that occurred, from every angle, called for a non-declaration and for new elections, and that the outcome of the recount was encouraged to be a declaration of the result, represented an effort, and successfully so, at regime change.
All right, Vincent, thanks again for being on. And let me also say this was a pleasure having this conversation. And I wish you happy 56. I don't know if to say happy, but I wish you nevertheless blessed, prosperous independence. And as we move towards continued self-determination through our different organizations, I wish you well and much more success.
Thank you very much, and I hope that the nation is not caught up in moderation, beachfront party, uh, parking lot party, to the expense of taking a moment off to understand where we've come from, where we're at, and where we need to go. Because all that I'm seeing about 56th anniversary is carnival, beachfront party, and those things, none of which, I'm not saying you shouldn't have those, but none of which seeks to address at the conscious level where we're at, what is required.
And while we see every effort is being made to shut down the Burnham Foundation exhibition. Thank you very much, Vincent. Thanks very much to my audience and to the Benchcap Foundation, in fact, to Mark Benchcap 107.1 for being on this evening. We will look to be on this Thursday. That's the day that I am normally on, so I hope that we can have a conversation on independence. If not, once Mark is around, we will share that platform and promote independence. So, again, thanks, Mr. Alexander. Thanks to you, the audience, and may Almighty God richly bless each and every one of you. Thanks, Lemon. Stay blessed.
activity by